This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Since the declaration of an independent republic in October of 2017, life in Catalonia has changed significantly. Invoking Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution, the central government in Madrid has seized control of public institutions, including police and public broadcasters, dissolved the Catalan regional government, and arrested several government ministers and activists. The ousted Catalan leader and 4 of his ministers are currently out on bail in Belgium after fleeing to Brussels, where their arrest was prompted by an EU warrant issued by Spain. Meanwhile, Catalonia has been racked by general strikes and protests in support of those arrested. An election to replace the sacked regional leaders is scheduled for the end of the year. To help us understand what's behind this crisis and what it might mean for Catalonia, Spain, and the EU, we're joined by Jeffrey Coleman, faculty member in the Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department at Marquette University. His research and teaching focus on 20th century and contemporary Spanish literature. He joins us having just returned from Barcelona, where he had a front row seat for the Catalan Independence Declaration and its aftermath. Jeffrey Coleman, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm wondering if we could start with sort of a Catalonia 101, the history of how it is that this region has its own identity.
All right. So I think to start, the main date I would start with is 1714. In that year, September 11th, ironically, of 1714 was the date in which Barcelona fell to the Spanish forces, which ended what was known as the War of Secession, in that the Habsburg dynasty had ended, and a new heir to the throne, now from the Bourbon dynasty, Philip V, was named, and it caused a geopolitical struggle throughout all of Europe. And so there were two sides, and the part of Spain, which is now Aragon and Catalonia, supported the Austrian chosen heir instead of choosing the Bourbon heir. And so 1714 is kind of the epicenter of that, because as a result of losing the war, Spain issued what are known as kind of the Decreto de Nueva Planta, which is essentially a centralization law. And it eliminated all of the kind of particularities of legal actions that were happening in Catalonia itself, in order to create a government that was much more aligned with what France had already done under Louis XIV, right, of making a more centralized federal government, and Spain was trying to do the same during the early 18th century. And so that is the moment that a lot of Catalan nationals use as kind of when their sovereignty was stripped. For a lot of people who are not familiar with Spain, Spain has 4 national languages, right? And Catalan, being one of them, is the second largest after what we know in the U.S. as Spanish. Castilian Spanish is the national language, and then there are a few others. One of them being Catalan, which is the language spoken in Catalonia, the Balearic Islands, Valencia, and parts of Aragon. And so there is a separate culture, and there's definitely a separate identity. But in terms of the actual independence movement itself, it's actually been more of a recent phenomenon that has led up to what we see in these last few weeks. If you were to go back maybe 10, 15 years ago and ask the average person in Barcelona if they were pro-independence, the answer probably would have been no. Even despite the Franco regime that lasted throughout most of the 20th century, there wasn't necessarily a very large pro-independence movement, but it seems to have surged up definitely in the last 5 years. And in my opinion, it seems as though the Spanish government has actually moved more people within the region towards wanting to become pro-independent through its kind of limits on the sovereignty and autonomy of the region.
So you mentioned the Franco years. Talk a little bit about some of the things that a person in Catalonia would find particularly offensive from that era.
Yes. So the Franco regime, which lasted from 1939 to 1975, during that time, all languages that were not Castilian Spanish were illegal. And this even came down to things such as naming your children. Your children could not have Catalan names. They had to have Spanish names. And so you'll see with a lot of people, for example, born in the 60s or 70s, that after Franco died and entered into the Spanish democracy, that some people had their names translated on their identity cards so that they could reclaim their Catalan names that they might have had in their homes, but they couldn't use publicly due to the language laws. And many of the kind of Catalan festivals and traditions were illegal as well during that time. So there was definitely a cultural repression. I think more people outside of Spain are familiar with what happened in the Basque Country, right, as a result of ETA forming and the kind of violent reaction to what Franco had imposed on those regions. In Catalonia, there wasn't necessarily a counter group similar to ETA, but there were underground movements to keep the Catalan language alive, teaching it secretly in homes, or certain schools would like hide Catalan textbooks so that the students could learn the language and not forget it. As we saw for example, in the Basque Country, where there had to be kind of a large, what would the word be? Linguistic movement after Franco to reclaim the language, because so much of it had been lost.
Well, another source of contention is economic, is
Yes.
it not? So this is not a region of Spain without means.
Right. It's one of probably the most prosperous region in Spain, in part due to tourism, but definitely there's a huge financial sector, mainly in Barcelona. But then there are things such as the wine industry and the olive oil industry that definitely promote the wealth of Catalonia. But even going back to the earliest 20th century, Barcelona was the industrial center of Spain. A lot of the kind of modernization that took place at the beginning of the 20th century happened in Catalonia. Architecture, the textile industry, and so on. Barcelona was that epicenter. And you even saw it during the Franco years, when many people who were poor from the south of Spain moved to Barcelona to find work, because it was one of the only cities that had jobs. And so the region has throughout at least the 20th century up till today been that financial powerhouse of Spain.
And the issue is they basically put in more to the central kitty, if you will,
Exactly.
Then they get back out.
Exactly.
So talk a little bit about, as we look at the movement towards independence, what the split is within Catalan society. I mean, it was by no means a unanimous...
No, it's actually quite interesting, and for me, it doesn't seem clear one way or the other, because there's never been a legal push to find out, right? There have been 2 referendums, but neither one has really gotten a large enough quorum to really determine one way or the other, in my opinion, how the majority of Catalan society feels. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, and that's what's made the situation so polarized, is that no one knows if it's really 50-50, or if there's more people who are not in favor of independence that simply just don't go out and vote, or on the other end, if there are people who are in favor of independence who are blocked from voting, as we saw on October 1st, or, don't have the means or the capacity to get out and vote. So a lot of elderly folks. So it's quite unclear at this moment. And I think that's probably the root of the problem.
So walk us through that timeline, if you would, between the referendum and the run-up to the referendum was problematic politically as well.
So the referendum of October 1st was something proposed by the pro-independence government that is currently, or was currently, depending on how you view this, in charge of what is known as the Generalitat, which is the Catalan parliament. And they had proposed this referendum in order to find out once and for all if the Catalan population was in favor of independence or not. But the Spanish central government in Madrid said that this was an illegal referendum and did not want it to occur. So there was this whole underground kind of movement to make sure that it happened. And what ended up happening on the 1st is that ballot boxes arrived to elementary schools and high schools and so on, the voting precincts. And the Spanish National Guard, National Police, showed up to try and snatch these ballot boxes so that the vote could not happen. Unfortunately, it erupted in some police violence or police brutality against Catalan citizens. Many of those videos are all over social media and were broadcast in news outlets all over the world. And I think that created some tension, but I also think that not that it was necessarily intentional, but I think that does play into the goal of this kind of national project, right, which is to show that there is repression coming from Spain, and that justifies the need for an independent republic.
Well, and the National Police presumably were an instrument of the Franco regime, so the optics of people from the central government with truncheons in town is not good.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the current government in Madrid. I mean, on the sort of continuum of right-left European and Spanish politics.
Right. So within Spain, the Mariano Rajoy, who is the current prime minister, is from the Partido Popular, the Popular Party, which is one of Spain's most right-wing parties. Depending on who you speak to within Spain, some people kind of view it as a reincarnation of the fascist regime, since there are some elements of Franco that kind of are within the party. And so Spain is one of the few nations in Europe that doesn't have an extreme right, such as what we see in France with La Front National, or in Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands. And I think that has a lot to do with the Franco regime, that no one wants to go back to that, right? So there are right-wing parties, but none of them will explicitly come out to be as right-wing as what they had. And so these elements are kind of hidden within all of these parties. But Rajoy's party, which has been ruling since 2011, is on the right of that scale, but definitely not as far right as some other parties that you may see in the rest of Europe or within the EU.
And what about how this translates in terms of just nationalism? I mean, if you're a Spanish nationalist, the idea that someone could choose to secede has to be particularly offensive.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I found most fascinating during my trip is that, for example, the Spanish flag is a contentious issue in that it's usually associated with fascist and with the Franco regime. For whatever reason, the flag was kind of reivindicated and reclaimed by the anti-independence movement as a symbol of Spanish national unity, right? And so there became this notion of being a Spanish nationalist and using the flag as a symbolic representation. And even within the flag, there are representations of all the parts of Spain. So using the flag to call for that unity, but it's still problematic because historically, the flag is connected to such an atrocious moment within Spanish or Catalan history. And And so there is this kind of nationalism building on both sides, right? There's clearly a Catalan nationalist project, which is occurring, but I think as a result of that, or in response to the Catalan nationalism, there is a kind of resurgence of Spanish nationalism. And even during some of the pro-union protests that occurred in early October, there was a wide spectrum of people, right? There were people that simply wanted Spain to stay together, but then there were people who were connected to neo-Nazi parties or fascist parties or elements that wanted to maintain Spain in order to repress, right, these groups, so that they would stay in their place, so to speak. And that was probably the part that I thought was most problematic.
So a lot of the drivers of the independence movement seem to have been around for quite some time. So why in this moment in history did the decision come about to declare?
That is a great question. That's something I've been trying to ponder myself in terms of why it didn't happen earlier. I simply think that the events of the last couple of months have kind of been the straw that breaks the camel's back. I think what most people in Catalonia wanted was to have this referendum so that they could figure it out once and for all. There were a lot of references to Scotland and the Scottish referendum, which was sanctioned. It happened. It turned out to be a no. And then, life went on, right? There are still some contentions about that within Scotland and within the UK, but at least there was a sanctioned referendum. And I think that's probably the thing that most people just want to know. There's this uncertainty within Catalan society about, are we in favor or not? And I think that's probably what pushed this to occur, is that in repressing or attempting to repress the vote of October 1st, I think a lot of people within Catalonia, and definitely politicians, felt, okay, well, this might have to be the time, and we're just going to go ahead and step forward with the declaration.
The Spanish foreign minister had a quote I'd like to read here that speaks to this. He says, "We acknowledge there's a political situation that deserves to be looked at, but in any case, it's clear that the decision will have to be taken by all Spaniards." So that's part of the issue, right? That it shouldn't be unilateral on the side of the Catalonians. It has to be a national consensus that this is the way to go.
Right. But I think if you were to put it as a national referendum, then the answer would clearly be no. Because there are definitely parts of Spain, not solely the central government in Madrid, but there are regions of Spain that receive some of those tax dollars or tax euros from Catalonia and depend on that because they don't have the prosperity that Catalonia has. And so I think if it were put up to a national vote, it definitely would not occur.
Well, which is a good strategy if you're not too keen on the prospect of them leaving.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, let's widen out our focus a bit and look at the EU. It seems that there were some within the Catalan leadership that expected to be embraced by the EU, this whole idea of self-determination, and,
right.
And that certainly was not the case.
No, definitely not. And although that had been debated for quite some time about whether or not, if this were to occur in terms of a Catalan republic, if the EU would accept Catalonia as part of the EU, the large consensus was no. But I think the Catalan government wanted to try and set up a situation in which they could appeal to the EU. And so I think, for example, the police brutality that occurs on the 1st, right, in broadcasting that for the world to see was a good way to appeal to Brussels and to the EU members at large that, look, we're being repressed. The central government is attacking its own people, so therefore we should receive not only self-determination, but our entrance into the EU. Unfortunately, that didn't work out too well because Rajoy went to to meet with Merkel and May and Macron, the three M's, if you will, and they all have put their support behind the central government. And so that didn't really leave much room for the Catalan government to kind of to act in response to that. And so I think the declaration that was made a week and a half ago now, and the subsequent exile, if you will, of Carles Puigdemont and four of his ministers to Belgium is kind of a last resort, in a sense, to try and appeal to the EU for that self-determination.
But, you know, that's informed by other separatist movements, is it not? If you look around the EU, there are certainly other peoples that think they ought to be able to go their own way as well.
Right. And it's interesting because the Catalan movement is somewhat inspired by the Scottish movement, but also what's known as the Kosovo way, right? And they make reference to these two movements in order to say that the idea of secession is not new. There are nations within Europe that are quite young, if you look in the Balkans region, for example. And so it's interesting that Spain, being the first nation, really, within Europe, is now the one that might have the youngest addition to Europe if this independence movement is to go ahead.
Well, so we've talked about the run-up to the referendum, and now let's talk a little bit about Article 155 and how the Spanish Constitution gave the central government the tools to crack down.
So, Article 155 is one of those kind of pieces of the Constitution that no one ever thought would need to be enacted. And if you look at the language of it, it's not very clear what exactly the enactment of Article 155 involves. It simply says that the central government can intervene in the institutions of an autonomous region if things were to go awry, right? But it doesn't spell that out in terms of, well, how do you intervene? Do you simply sack the entire government and put in new people?
Which is essentially what happened.
Yes. What happens to the issue of language? Is Catalan no longer co-official? There are all these questions that have not been answered and cannot be answered because the actual article doesn't give the room. So it's really left up to the Supreme Court and to the central government to determine how they want to implement this policy. And as of right now, it seems to have been more of an extreme route, right? Like sack all the members, put as many of them in jail as possible, put in new people, call for elections, and kind of start at zero. But that's hard to do based off the kind of momentum of the movement throughout the month of October. And so that has led to some of the street protest throughout Catalonia in the past few days.
So while you were there, I mean, this response was unwinding. Did you notice any sense on the street of changes in attitude towards the prospect of independence as a result of that pushback?
Yes. So the day before the referendum, I was still in Madrid, and one of the things that's interesting, and I think this happens a lot in the U.S. too, is how news outlets target different parts of the country with their news. And so the way the Catalan independence movement is described in Madrid and other big cities around Spain is very different than how it's discussed within Catalonia. And so I happened to be walking in downtown Madrid and speaking in Catalan to a friend on the phone, and someone yelled at me that, you know, we don't speak Catalan here, right? And so I was like looking around, trying to figure out, well, what? Okay, so let me switch back to Spanish to be safe, just because, you know, I wasn't sure what might come out of that conversation if this, you know, man were to approach me. And then in Barcelona, especially after the 3rd, which was the day of the general strikes, you could definitely notice the tension is palpable. Depending on who you spoke to in the city, you could tell that there was simply a sense of uneasiness throughout the city. I think the only people that were kind of immune to that were tourists. I think the tourists were just, going to the Sagrada Familia and going to the beach like they normally do. But I definitely felt that there was a clear sense of tension and uncertainty, whether you were pro-independence or not, that you just didn't know what was going to happen next.
Well, we're down to our last minute or so. The election to replace the regional government has been scheduled. So what do you think is the outcome after that?
So the elections are set for December 21st, and it looks as though it depends on what the central government does in terms of the independence parties. They haven't announced whether or not those parties will be criminalized or not. And if they are, and you can't vote for them, then what could happen is that the Socialist Party or the Popular Party, which is more the Conservative Party, could end up taking control over the Catalan parliament.
Well, that's a fascinating tale. We'll keep an eye on that. Jeffrey Coleman, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.